thank you for joining us, everybody in this room and everybody on the screen with us, everybody who will be watching this as a video on YouTube fairly soon. I'll explain in a moment about the recording and what that implies about our conversation here. My name is Matthias Wisse, and I'm the director of the Carr-Ryan Center for Human Rights Policy. And I'm delighted to be here today with Peter Beinart, who is, of course, a well-known commentator, journalist, a long-time contributor to foreign affairs, generally the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, US-Israel relations, specifically is the editor of at large at Jewish Currents, the author of Beinart Notebook on Substack, which is a great resource I have found in recent times. He is also a professor of journalism at the Newmark School at CUNY, an MSNBC analyst, a strong presence in this field and has been for a long time. He is also a native of Came here, so welcome back home, Peter. So let me say a few things about the stage setting, the context in which we are operating here, and also the constraints on what we are doing here, the kind of conversation we're going to have here. So first of all, of course, we are all keenly aware that we are living at a historical moment here. There is a turning point happening. We had a turning point in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict right now. Countless lives are being changed massively through that. The strategic dimensions of politics in that region are changed, and we have no way at this stage really understanding where this will be going, because this is really history in motion. Many of the actors who are involved now may no longer be involved in a year or two, in fact, may no longer be alive, given how things are going. The situation, both sides of this conflict, for good reason, have described the casualties in terms of superlatives of sorts. So the dimensions of this, you all know, are truly dramatic. So it is a turning point, and we are in no position to say where this will be going. So we need to process. We need to kind of understand what's going on, partly what's going on the ground, but also partly what's going on in opinion formation, how people relate to that, what people want to do going forward, how that is changing, how that might be different across generations. So there's a fascinating range of topics here also. So much of what we have seen on campus in recent times has to do with the fact that generational differences come to the fore in addition to a number of other underlying conflicts. So that's just a background to all of that. I want to know from many of you this whole episode, obviously by itself, but also conversations about this are painful. Many of you are connected to the region, very first order. Many of you I know are from there. You know people who are from there. I know we have people at the school who had people who were taken hostage, people who were killed that days. And so I know there's a lot of pain here in this room and on the screen on campus. I want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge that there's a lot of fear going on right now. So it's actually really striking. You talk to students really ranging from undergraduates, PhD students, everybody involved, and people are worried about saying things, about being recorded for saying things, having their names doxed out there. So the whole doxing episode, I think, has had profound impacts on the conversation culture on campus. Many faculty are not available for commentary. Partly because for many this is painful all by itself, but then also we have seen what can happen to faculty and what the targeting means, and this goes way beyond obviously being part of a social media drama, but this can amount to death threats and pretty bad things. So there is also that. So there's a lot of fear, and it's because of that we have adopted a certain format for what we are doing here. Try to make a bit of a trade-off between various desiderata. So a lot of people ask, can this be online? Can this be available for people who can't be in the room? And there's a legitimate interest in that. So it will not just be recorded; it will be on the Carr Center YouTube. So it will be available in the future also. In terms of what this means for the camera and for the audio, so only Peter and I will be on camera. So the only image of this will be the two of us. And in terms of the questions, so you can ask questions, you and also the people on the screen, you can ask questions later in three different ways. And actually, I should say, they don't just have to be questions. So we want this to be as much as a conversation as possible. So if you think we missed something, if you think something else needs to be said, so it can also be that kind of thing. It doesn't just have to be specific questions. So it's going to be 3 ways of doing that. The first version is the old-fashioned version. You go to the mic, you introduce yourself, and you ask your question. The second version is a version of the old-fashioned version. You go to the mic and you do not introduce yourself and you ask your question. So we want to make sure that questions and statements do not remain unstated and unasked because people are worried that their name will otherwise be on YouTube. So it's for those of you in the room, it's also fine from the mics to just say something without introducing yourself, or just say maybe just enough as needed to substantiate the question. And the third way of asking a question, and that applies to both people in the room and people on the screen, you can send an email to Maggie Gates, our executive director. There is signs on the columns there of her email. So this is M Gates. So this is the word gate with an M in front and an S at the end. M Gates at HKS-Harvard.edu. So M Gates at HKS-Harvard.edu. Maggie will be screening that, and in this way you can get your question and your comment in without ever making an appearance at all. I feel rather strange, and it's very painful to have to do it this way, but this is unfortunately the situation we're in. And again, the concern here is to make sure that we're getting these thoughts out and without people being worried about that. Let me also just say just a couple of sentences about what my own connection is to this situation, then I will start my conversation with Peter. So I'm a German citizen. I grew up in Germany. I grew up with a lot of processing of Holocaust, Nazi failure, German failure in the Nazi period. This has been part of my upbringing. I spent a year in Israel. I studied in Israel, lived in Jerusalem for a year a long time ago. It was the year leading up, the year right before the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, particular political atmosphere then. I was a student of mathematics there, actually, so I didn't go for the usual religious reasons to Israel, but there was a particular person at the Hebrew University I was working with, and it was a very peculiar year in many ways. As it happened, my roommate and I, we rented a house from Holocaust survivors. It was not planned, it just kind of worked out this way. This was the middle of the 90s. There were still a lot more Holocaust survivors in Israel, and so we got connected to some of them, and that was a very striking appearance for me as a German to get connected to this. My advisor, the person for whose sake I went to Israel, is a fairly visible person in the Israeli academic scene. Robert Aumann, Israel Aumann, is a mathematical economist, has since also gotten the Nobel Prize in economics, and he's also known as a person on the right wing of the political spectrum. So I got connected to that perspective. He had lost his only son in the Lebanon war in the 80s, so I got connected to this side of the story. I also started visiting the West Bank during that time. So I saw a lot about what was happening in the West Bank at that time. And so my concern coming out of that, and so the work I've done since in various roles and in my own academic work, both in human rights and in political philosophy, I feel is to the extent that it had anything to do with the situation down there, to make sure that the moral complexity of the situation is present, that we see the different sides of the story, since I firmly believe a future of if there is any possibility of a future resolution, then acknowledging the moral complexity, acknowledging the different legitimate interests on these various sides is absolutely key. And that's also been the gist of the Carr-Center work in this regard in recent months. But now, without further ado, so Peter, so just so that we start hearing you, get used to hearing your voice. So you're an observant Jew. You live in a Jewish community. You are broadly respected across various communities. So you actually you
may be subject to debate, but yeah.
Maybe just turning it over to you. So let's say a few things about what this conflict means to you, what it has meant to you over time, how you have felt about all this in recent weeks.
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you, Matthias, and thank you, Maggie and Emma, for everyone who kind of organized this. I guess I also just wanted to start by saying that, if you are, one of my favorite lines from Jewish texts is from Pirkei Avot, from the Mishnah, where it says, "Who is wise? The one who learns from all people." So if that means that if you are the person here in the room or in the audience who most fervently disagrees with me, you are the person who's made the greatest effort to learn from all people, and you are a model, it seems to me, for all of us. Because I think one of the things that plagues this conversation, like many other conversations, is that people tend to only listen to the people they disagree with. So I'm always particularly moved and impressed when people come who really strongly disagree with me. So thank you for being here. I think that, for me, one of the things that makes Judaism really intriguing is the tension that exists between a religion that has a universal ethical message, like other monotheistic religions, and a religion that is also built around the idea of a particular people, a kind of imagined as a kind of an extended family. So in the book of Genesis, you have this family, and then in the book of Exodus, which we're reading now, it becomes a nation, a people, but imagined as a kind of extended family, Bnei Israel, the children of Israel. And so there's this inbuilt tension between the moral obligations we have to all people. After all, Torah doesn't start with Jews. It starts with universal human beings, Adam and Eve and Noah. They're not Jews. And the obligations we have to one another. Those kind of quasi-familial obligations. And I guess for me, I did not really say how challenging holding those two imperatives would be until fairly late in life, because I had very little experience with Palestinians. I think in a rather uncomplicated way that it was pretty simple that Israel's existence as a Jewish state was non-negotiable, but that Palestinians would have their own state in the West Bank and Gaza, and therefore that would be a way of balancing the kind of moral obligation to Palestinians to have citizenship with the Jewish imperative of a state that provided Jewish security. I think that my grandmother was a big influence on me. She experienced the fragility of a lot of Jewish communities as someone who grew up in Alexandria, Egypt, and then lived in the Belgian Congo of all places, and then lived the rest of her life in South Africa. And I always could see from her, and she tried to impress upon me a lot, that without a Jewish state, Jews were always in a state of a kind of existential fragility. But a Jewish state, even if you weren't living there, it kind of provided you, if not just physical security, a kind of a psychic security. It certainly did for her. I could see that very clearly. And one of the things she used to get very annoyed with me about when I was a kid was always telling her how great America was. And she was constantly telling me not to think America was something you could depend on. It was embarrassingly late in my life, really in my early 30s, when I first spent time in the West Bank and started to listen to Palestinians. And it became clear to me that trying to find that balance was actually much more difficult than I had realized. Partly it was difficult just because it became increasingly clear to me that Israel wasn't, that the prospects of a creation of a Palestinian state were really, really unlikely, that Israel's policies in particular, entrenching its control in the West Bank, meant that this was likely to be one integrated political unit, not one that was likely to be partitioned. But even beyond that, to recognize that if one takes the right of Palestinians to be free and to be equal seriously, which it's kind of easier not to do when Palestinians are just an abstraction. But when you actually listen to Palestinians, you get to know Palestinians. It's harder. I was forced to grapple with more. Then more fundamental questions about the idea of a Jewish state emerge, right? Which is, why is it that Jews have the right to return to Israel after 2,000 years, whereas Palestinians can't return as refugees after 75 years? What ethical system is that makes that make sense, right? Or how could Palestinian citizens ever truly be equal in a Jewish state, right? I mean, a Jewish state, honestly, I feel like is a little too euphemistic, right? It's a little too sanitized. I mean, what Israel really is a Jewish supremacist state. It's a state in which Jews enjoy legal supremacy over Palestinians, in the most extreme way in the West Bank, of course, but also inside Israel proper, right? If you just look at the way Israel allocates land, right, through the Israel Land Authority, which gives almost half its seats to the Jewish National Fund, which distributes land for the use of Jews. So I think that for me was a process of a real struggle that I still really struggle with to this day. And there are many days when I'm not sure that I find that I have the right balance. I know that there are many, many people who look at, in my community, who look at people like me and think that, frankly, we don't care about other Jews. We don't care about whether Jews in Israel are safe. We don't feel a sense of solidarity with them. So I think to myself every day, how can I prove to them that I feel these things at a very, very deep level? And more than prove it, how do I prove it to myself? How do I make sure that that's true for me? How can I, especially when, when more than 100 Jews are living as hostages right now, what is that obligation does that impose on me every day? And on the other hand, how can I meet the moral obligation of a moment when something is happening that is truly surreal in its magnitude and its horror? I mean, I'll just quote, so I just read this in the paper today. He's been quoted before, but this is from Alex DeWall at Tufts. So he writes, I've been studying this topic, he means starvation, for almost 40 years, and I have not seen a situation in which a population was reduced with this speed, this rigor, this comprehensiveness to a state of starvation. It is unprecedented since World War I. So I feel on the one hand, kind of always this feeling that none of us will ever have been judged to have done enough in this moment of unprecedented horror. And also the recognition that many people who I care very deeply about believe that I'm fundamentally deficient in my obligation to other Jews. So that's the balance.
Thank you for that. So let me, one thing I'd like to do with you is just to go through a number of central concepts that are being used here in this context, beginning with the concept of Zionism. So Zionism is a broad house, has meant different people, has evolved over time, has evolved certainly in your thinking. So the way I think about that, the key idea of that is that there should be a safe place for Jews, that it should be in Palestine. So Zion obviously is a location, is a place in Jerusalem that one can visit. So it's connected to the region. Presumably it's connected to a state of sorts, given that that's the kind of political order we live in. But other than that, Zionism as such leaves open a lot of questions, right? So what kind of state? Is it a religious state? And how might a religious state be also democratic and human rights abiding or different? Where does it leave the Palestinians? What kind of arrangements would be made for the Palestinians? How do we think about the distribution of the territory? How much territory would belong to the state and possibly to another? So there's possibilities here to develop Zionism in different ways. You often have been called the most prominent liberal Zionist of your generation. Can you maybe tell us, what does it mean to be a liberal Zionist, and are you still one? Does it still make sense to be a Zionist, a liberal Zionist in 2023 for you?
Yeah. I mean, I guess, so I think Zionism emerging in the late 19th century, I think, believes that the creation of a Jewish, let's say, presence in Israel, in Palestine, in the land of Israel, although at various points Zionists were open in other places, I think it had two functions, some more for some people than others. One was safety, right? The other was kind of cultural expression or full realization, right? The sense that Jews would only be truly actualized if they were no longer minorities in a diaspora. So there were people who believed that, and it was not necessarily as obvious early on that needed to take the form of a sovereign state, right? Maybe it could take the form of some kind of Jewish cultural autonomy within the Ottoman Empire. There were people who called themselves cultural Zionists, like Martin Buber and Judah Magnus, who believed in the importance of a Jewish culture, Jewish society even, but didn't support a Jewish state, opposed partition, believed in a binational state. To me, I guess so I think there are roads not taken in Zionism that maybe could have meant a Zionism without a Jewish supremacist state. That was not the road that was taken. The road that was taken was political Zionism that is now almost indistinguishable in public conversation from the idea of a state that favors Jews over Palestinians. Now, Jews may disagree with what they want to do with that state, but the essence is that Jews run things, right? I think that's the essence of it. So I don't think I could call myself a liberal political Zionist. I don't believe in a state that privileges Jews over Palestinians. I do find the idea of cultural Zionism appealing, a non-state cultural Zionism, because it's a way for me of connecting to a tradition that expresses the importance for me of a thriving Jewish presence, which can maintain a kind of Jewish cultural production but to me, that has to be within conditions of legal equality, of equality under the law, and indeed of historical justice. There also has to be an effort of historical justice as well. So I would call myself a cultural Zionist. I find that almost nobody believes me when I say that, and mostly they say I'm an anti-Zionist. But to me, the terms are perhaps less important than I think the principles at stake. And so for me, I don't believe that in the long term, Jewish safety is best protected by a system of Jewish supremacy. And the reason I don't believe that is because when you hold millions of Palestinians without basic rights, you are inflicting a tremendous amount of structural violence on them. Now, often that violence may be hidden from us, or hidden from Israeli Jews. It is the nature of kind of violence that exists toward the oppressed populations, but it's a profound amount of constant violence. And it seems to me if you were imposing huge amounts of violence upon people, that violence is likely to, in some form or another, endanger you at some point as well. And that doesn't mean certainly does not mean I justify attacks on Israeli civilians, not at all. But the point is that it's difficult that system of violence it's not easy to segregate it entirely off to one population. And I believe that ultimately divided societies are safer for all people and more peaceful for all people when all people have a voice in government. And again, I'm probably influenced here by being the child of South Africans, but that most white South Africans just took it for granted because the ANC was an armed resistance organization. It was not a nonviolent organization. It had a military wing, Mkhonto was his way, right? So the assumption was, if you get rid of the protective shell of a white supremacist state, then Mkhonto Sizwe and all of its cadres will just it be very easy for them to kill you in very, very large numbers, right? In fact, Mkhonto Sizwe didn't have a reason to exist once Black South Africans had to vote, right? Because when people have the opportunity to have government be accountable to them through actions like voting, because they're citizens, right? Then I think the impetus to use violence actually goes way down. And I think that's the lesson of Northern Ireland. I mean, right? Northern Ireland was considered a very scary organization. They put up bombs in front of the Harrods department store, right? But that stopped when Catholics gained political equality. So I believe that the desire for Jewish safety and Jewish security is very legitimate, and the desire for Jewish flourishing and self-expression is also very legitimate. But I believe I'm obviously a small minority. I'm a minority in this view, but I believe actually that both of those things will be better served over the long term under conditions of legal equality. And I also worry that if Israel doesn't come to that realization, and if American policy doesn't change, and we don't help Israel move towards the recognition that Palestinians have to have freedom, and they have to have citizenship, either in their own state or, as I think would be more likely, in the state that exists, then Israel will be having to manage all of these people who lack basic human rights. And I think that one of the things that October 7th showed is that it's actually very, very difficult to manage millions of people that you deny the most basic human rights to. Management process has now collapsed, right? And what frightens me about this is that if Israelis realize, many Israeli Jews realize that if it's not on the table to give Palestinians their freedom, and if you can't manage Palestinians, then it seems to me the voices in Israel that have the most coherent answer to that problem are the people who propose expulsion. And those views, it seems to me, are very, very strong in Israel today. And I worry that they will even grow stronger over the years to come, because I don't see anyone in Israel, even the people who are not calling for expulsion, are not calling for Gaza to be a place where human beings can live, right? It was unlivable before October 7th. It's now completely unlivable. And now the idea is that people are going to herd into even smaller territories, with Israel controlling the borders and what goes in and out with even more ferocity. This is making the situation for people unlivable. And it seems to me that naturally seems to me, in the direction of expulsion, and also in the direction of mass death, which is what we're seeing. And that's something that scares me a lot.
Let me ask you about anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism comes, there's a range of ways in which this has been formulated, also officially defined, and certainly in day-to-day use, there's a broad range of usage. There's a fairly narrow usage where anti-Semitism is an expression of visceral hatred against Jews. And then there's a much broader notion of anti-Semitism that is quite commonly used these days, where also any kind of criticism of Zionism and Israeli politics is understood as anti-Semitic. And that is it's not entirely pointless, I think, to think this way. So I can motivate that by thinking, people who want to use it this way. An outlet these days for this visceral hatred of Jews is criticism of Zionism and Israel. And so that's why this needs to be included. I think that is the rationale why some people want to use it this way. But of course, what that means is that the term anti-Semitism, so certainly for me as a German, anti-Semitism is being accused of anti-Semitism is one of the heaviest things that can be thrown into anyone's face, because it basically means, if you had the opportunity of supporting concentration camps, you would do it. Right? So it's a very heavy accusation. But of course, what this broad use of anti-Semitism means is that whole range of criticism of Israel, from specific criticisms of governmental measures, from advocacy for boycotts, sanctions, measures like that, all of that is condemned as anti-Semitic. The work of many scholars of anti-Semitism, including our very own, is happening this week. Derek Penzler was appointed to the Anti-Semitism Task Force, is condemned as anti-Semitic because he advocated for a narrow understanding of anti-Semitism as this very broad one. The views in particular, you have often in your work talked about an age gradient and attitudes towards Israel. Many views of younger Jewish people, critical views of Israel, are condemned as anti-Semitic. So, but we get these accusations. Harvard has been called, Harvard is anti-Semitic. There was a plane going around here, Harvard is anti-Semitic. And how much anti-Semitism do you see on American campuses, on Harvard campus? What kind of anti-Semitism problem do you think universities have?
Yeah, it's funny. I remember a few years ago, the Simon Wiesenthal Center put out a list of the most anti-Semitic organizations in the United States, and I looked and half of them were Jewish, and I was thinking, we Jews are amazing. We can thrive in any industry, even anti-Semitism. We can take over the anti-Semitism industry. It's just, what can we do? I think, I guess I have to say a couple of things. First of all, I think if one of the reasons that what's happening to Derek Penzler is so profoundly depressing is that actually it's people like Derek Penzler and other scholars that we need to actually help us understand anti-Semitism, right? Because they're actually people who do scholarly research and have backgrounds to understand these things, right? Which is not something that the people at the ADL have, right? And they're also not doing that work with the agenda of protecting a particular government, right? So I found the work that I found most interesting in terms of understanding American anti-Semitism, the research is been done by Eitan Hirsch at Tufts and Laura Roden here at Harvard, when they look at ideology and anti-Semitism in the United States. And they find that, they have just basic questions like, thermometer, how do you feel about Jews? Do Jews, are they disloyal? Do they, I can't remember exact questions, can you trust them, that kind of thing. They find that anti-Semitism those attitudes are far, far higher on the right than they are on the left. So I think that's the kind of, because the American Jewish establishment is really invested in the idea that basically it's about equal, right? When you think about it, we would not imagine that anti-Black racism is as strong on the American left as it is on the American right, or anti-LGBT feeling or misogyny, right? The American right is basically invested in these kind of hierarchies between historically privileged groups and historically unprivileged groups. So it would be kind of odd if anti-Semitism were this one kind of bigotry that basically, unlike those other bigotries, was equidistant between a kind of ideology that by its nature is equality-oriented and by its nature is inequality-oriented, right? And in fact, it turns out anti-Semitism is actually a lot more like the others, right? So that's, I think, the first thing. The second thing is that that's not to say that there isn't anti-Semitism on the left, right? I think that what the studies that I've looked at show is that when there is more violence in Israel-Palestine in particular, there are more reported anti-Semitic incidents. There was a study done in the US, there was a study done in Belgium, and a study done in Australia, which all show this. They particularly found that in periods of time where the IDF killed more Palestinians, there were an increase in reported anti-Semitic attacks, right? So I think we have to theorize, imagine kind of what exactly is going on there. But I think one possibility is that people who are hostile to Israel are taking out that hostility on Jews or Jewish institutions, which is wrong, right? I mean, it's just as wrong as it would be to take out your hostility against Iran or against Pakistan or against Al-Qaeda or whoever, against Muslims in the United States, or to take out your hostility against the People's Republic of China against Chinese Americans, right? If you oppose a state, its policies, its ideologies, you oppose a state who are linked in ethnicity or religion or ancestry from that state are not responsible for what that state does, right? So it's easy, one has to be really clear about that distinction. And if we demand that people in the pro-Palestine solidarity world are clear about this distinction between Israel as state and Jews or Jewishness we also, it seems to me, the organized American Jewish community has to be clear about that distinction as well, right? But the problem is it often is not clear about this distinction, right? Because it wants to depict supporting Israel or being Zionist as inherent in being Jewish, right? But if you say that, right, then you're actually doing exactly the same conflation, it seems to me, that we want to insist that people cannot do, right? The chief rabbi of the United Kingdom said a while back that Zionism, not Zion, right, the idea of this place, but Zionism, a movement which starts in the late 19th century, leaps from every page of the Siddur, of the Jewish prayer book, right? Which is an odd statement because there have been Jewish prayer books long before there was political Zionism. But if you say that, and then someone writes Free Palestine on a Siddur, on a prayer book, how are you going to object, right? So I think that's one thing that I think we need to make clear about. On the question of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, first of all, there have always been Jewish anti-Zionists, right? Sometimes their numbers may have been smaller, let's say between the 1940s and this period than they were before that. But they were always there, right? The Satmar Hasidim are the largest Hasidic group in the world, right? They read Masechet Ketubot and the Three Oaths as saying that Jews cannot recreate a Jewish state without the Messiah, right? And they have rallies that are bigger than AIPAC's national conference where their rabbis say that, right? So I mean, it seems to me one can have a lot of views about the Satmar Rebbe, right? Some good, some bad. But the idea that he's an anti-Semite seems to me odd, right? Secondly, there's a long tradition of Jews who did not believe in the idea of an ethno-nationalist state as a solution to the Jewish problem, right? They've always been there, and their numbers are, in the United States, significantly growing, right? So if you're going to say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, then you are going to have to look at a younger generation of American Jews where, according to a 2021 poll, 38% of American Jews under the age of 40 said Israel's an apartheid state. I think the percentage who said it wasn't is like 43%, right? So it's a pretty even split, right? And my guess would be it's higher now, right? So are you going to basically, I mean, what does it even mean for the future of Jewish life in the United States to declare all of those people to be anti-Semites, right? It's a disaster for the continuation of Jewish life because we should be investing in those Jewish students' Jewish lives, right? So they can have richer, deeper lives. And if we basically say that they're anti-Semites, right, you're there in Chayrim, right? It makes no sense, right? And I think it's actually a disaster for Jewish institutions, right? Because we lose that, we need to actually invest in those people, right? So they can help to sustain and build a vibrant Jewish life in the United States. And perhaps more importantly in all of that, if you say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, you are saying that essentially all Palestinians are anti-Semites, right? Because even if you think Zionism is the greatest thing that's ever happened to Jews, you can't possibly argue it's been a good thing for Palestinians, right? That it's been a great experience for them, right? It starts with their expulsion in 1948 and it kind of goes downhill from there, right? So like you're basically saying that all Palestinians are bigots and therefore they don't need to be listened to. And in fact, if they're really bigots, we should probably criminalize them and ban and suspend their organizations, which in fact is what the Anti-Defamation League and other Jewish organizations are now trying to do, right? So in the name of being against bigotry, you're doing something which is profoundly bigoted and dehumanizing, which is basically, you're basically saying an entire group of people should not have the right to speak from their experience, and you're defining their narrative of their experience, their permission to narrate, as Edward said, as bigotry. And I just to say that equality under the law, the principle that we're struggling for in the United States with some difficulty, is when applied to Israel-Palestine, not just wrong, not just naive, not just it won't work, but that it's bigotry is just downright Orwellian. Right? How can it be that legalized group supremacy is not bigotry, but equality under the law is bigotry? Right? I think this is the move of people who do not have good arguments. Right? What they have is the moral capital created by previous generation of Jews, not them, who suffered the kinds of things you're talking about that created this sense of kind of power around the world of anti-Semitism. They should be treating it with a certain reverence, right? With a certain, as sacrosanct, as not something to be thrown around lightly, and yet they use it in the most promiscuous and vicious ways, basically to try to shut down people, because it would be very difficult to actually have these arguments, right? And it seems to me what's incumbent about universities is to maintain the possibility of having these conversations, to actually having an educational function. Because although the ADL and these groups would like you to believe that Jewish students on college campuses are all just cowering in their rooms because of pro-Palestine anti-Semitism, right? And there is Semitism that comes from that world. I don't want to suggest there's not. But in my experience, from what I hear, there's also a lot of actual education that takes place, a lot of really valuable conversations in which Jewish students who have been raised in communities that never gave them any access or exposure to Palestinian viewpoints, or never read a book by a Palestinian, or never knows the synagogue, never brought in a Palestinian. They meet Palestinians, right? And it's actually a process of education. It's actually even in some ways a process for some of them of liberation, right? Of being liberated from this kind of dehumanizing and racist views that they were raised with about Palestinians. And that can be very uncomfortable, but that's supposed to be what education is about, right? I mean, this is a quote that I really like. It says, "Discomfort is not injury. An intellectual provocation is not a physical assault. It's a stimulus. Over time, it can improve our own arguments and sometimes even change our minds." That's from Bret Stephens. It seems to me, if that's the vision that we want, that we believe for all people, you know, given that what they come to university for, that's the attitude we should have here. Of course, if Jewish students are being harassed, if God forbid there's physical violence against them, if they're being mistreated by their professors in some way, that's unacceptable, right? But intellectual discomfort, right, it seems to me, is actually what a university is supposed to be about.
Next notion I'd like to ask you about, you already mentioned it, apartheid. So just to explain that for the audience, so apartheid is actually obviously originating in the context of South Africa, has since, however, made its way into international law. So it's a defined notion in international law. Roughly speaking, it means three things. It means an intention to dominate, it means a set of oppressive practices in place, and it means acts of cruelty being practiced. And apartheid has been used for a number of years by both international human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Israeli human like B'Tselem, to characterize the Israeli policies of occupation, specifically in the West Bank. At the same time, for many people in the especially in the Jewish community, but also in Germany, it would also problematic that in countries where solidarity, a certain understanding of solidarity with Israel is very politically prominent, to think of Israel as an apartheid state is unthinkable, or as it's offensive, is something bizarre, because Israel is a nation of survivors, is a nation of victims, is a nation of people who have escaped from centuries of persecution. How could such a state possibly be an apartheid state? That looms, and that's why we're seeing these incredibly visceral reaction. And of course, if you acknowledge practices of apartheid in the West Bank, that doesn't mean that's the only thing worth saying about Israel, right? People say, well, it's the only functioning democracy in the region, and yeah, but these things are consistent. How do you deal with this is very painful, especially for people older people in the older generation, to hear that Israel is practicing apartheid. How do you engage with that?
I mean, first of all, I would say that there's, it's tragic that people on the national level, like on the individual level, who were abused and victimized, can abuse and victimize others, right? But there's nothing about being a victim or being abused in other circumstances that means that you can't inflict that on other people, right? And I always feel like, I'm not German, so I can't understand what that experience is really like, but it seems to me it seems to me if one's interpretation of German history and of the Holocaust is that you have a special obligation to Jews, right? Irrespective of what a Jewish state does, I don't understand. And the lesson of the Holocaust wouldn't be that Germans have a special, profound obligation to the question of human dignity in general, and that and absolutely the lives and safety and dignity of Jews, but not at the expense of other people. And if Germans imagine, as I imagine they do, about the question of what kind of courage it must have taken in the 1940s to stand up for the lives and dignity of Jews, then I would ask them, you know, if that's what you wished your grandparents or grandparents had that level of courage, you're not being asked to show that level of courage, right? You're not, all you're being asked to show is the courage of that some person will call you an anti-Semite, because you stand up for the principle that Palestinians, that we shouldn't have, you know, 10,000 Palestinian children being killed, that we shouldn't have Palestinian children being operated on without anesthesia, that we shouldn't have 10 Palestinian children's limbs being amputated a day. Okay, so it takes some courage to say that and then have some stupid politician or Israeli minister or Jewish organization leader or someone call you anti-Semite. That's a lot less courage than it would have taken in the 1940s. So if you want to learn from history, then you could at least start there. That would be my view. On the question of you know, apartheid, I mean, I guess I would say, you know, to people who really find the term really, really upsetting, I would say, go to the West Bank, spend a day with Palestinians. Listen to them talk about what it's like to live your entire life under the control of a state where you don't have the most basic of rights, a state where you can't become a citizen, a state where where a government that has life and death power over you is not accountable to you because you can't vote, where your Jewish neighbors live under civil law with full due process and free movement, and you live under a military court system with 99% prosecution, and you need a military pass if you want to go to Jerusalem or other places. And if you don't like the term apartheid, you can tell me what you think, you know, find your own language, right? You want to describe it some other way, describe it some other way, right? If the term somehow, you know, is a block for you, but don't just deny that it exists, right? Don't just kind of avert your eyes from this reality, right? And that's what I find most troubling, is just the ability of people in the Jewish community, people who many people who I love, I admire, I think are, you know, just to avert their eyes, you know, and never so much since October 7th. I mean, I just, every day, sometimes I walk into Jewish institutional spaces and think, like, are people not seeing what I'm seeing? Like, are they just not, I mean, Abraham Joshua Heschel said, I think it was 1967, that every time he opened a prayer book, a Jewish prayer book, a siddur, he saw the body of a child napalm. He saw the body of a Vietnamese child who'd been hit by napalm. That was his experience of living during the Vietnam War, right? And so I just wonder, like, why don't people in our community, more of them, have that experience about this moment, that they just have these images in their heads and they can't get them out of their heads, because I can't get that out of my head, you know? And I'm only experiencing a tiny fraction of what my Palestinian friends and colleagues and other people are experiencing, let alone what people are in Gaza, you know? And so it's, again, the terminology is less important to me. To me, more important is just some engagement with Palestinian humanity and with the reality of what it actually means to be a Palestinian under Israeli control, especially in Gaza right now.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you about one more concept, and then we're going to open up for questions. We're not going to finish at 6 o'clock, obviously. We are prepared to go until 6:30, so there's going to be time for discussion, for conversation. The last concept I'd like to ask you about is settler colonialism, something you have yourself not mentioned today, but I know it's been on your mind. You have done work with that. Other people have worked on that. So it's an interesting debate also, both among political commentators, historians, what the analytical purchase of that notion is when applied to the context of Israel, and one can readily think of some pros to some advantages of doing that by seeing certain similarities with other scenarios, also in terms of what happened to the people who already live there. One can see when historical category is formed, certain as a problem with that, right? Certain categories formed and all sorts of differences are covered up, and then one wants to say certainly, Jewish migration to Israel can't just be run together with the one example that you like using, the French conquest of Algeria, right? There was something very different going on. So there is some mixed value to that. It's used though, so it's debated, and for many people, the reaction to that is also a very visceral reaction. How could this possibly be appropriate? One interesting kind of work that you have done with this recently is actually, so you have asked the question, why is part of the American public, why is part of the American establishment so strongly against any kind of pro-Palestinian expression of solidarity? Why is this so strong that, for example, the state of Alabama or Arkansas makes it illegal to be involved in boycotts against Israel? You can't work for the state of Arkansas if you do that. How can this be explained? How can be the strength of negativity against any expression of Palestinian solidarity? How can this be explained? And a very intriguing thesis that you have there, well, that is because these are two settler colonial societies, right? So you say basically the United States and Israel have a lot in common. There's a group of people who dominates there, and with similar themes, they came to a promised land. They had to push a frontier. They had to get their own feet on the ground, quite literally, by dispossessing other people. So it runs fairly deep, right? And so basically for American establishment to accept solidarity with Palestinians means to accept solidarity with people who question their own legitimacy. So runs fairly deep. So my question for you, so maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit, and then also so I personally, I'm perfectly fine talking about apartheid. I think that's completely appropriate. I myself refrain so far from talking about settler colonialism because I think it covers up too much. But my question for you is, how would one go about validating that? This thesis about that this explains the strong, how would one go about substantiating that?
So I don't think I can really substantiate it. It's just more of a hypothesis I have that the language of, there's been some willingness to reckon in the United States with, I think, kind of what it would mean to try to have historical justice for Black Americans, not that much, but a little bit. I think debates about Confederate monuments and stuff like that, but I actually think it would be, this is a point that Mahmoud Mamdani has made, it actually much more destabilizing how to really reckon with what historical justice would mean for Native Americans, given that, that's all of our founding fathers, so many of our most revered presidents were basically, oh, sorry, did I? Can you? We're basically people who were involved in the dispossession of Native Americans, and I do think the language that you see here in Palestine solidarity circles of decolonization, oftentimes referring to the United States as Turtle Island, the land back. I mean, I do think there is a strong. I think you hear much. In an interesting way, I think Native Americans who were so completely absent from American discussions kind of come into the conversation through Palestine solidarity, language, and discourse in a way that they almost never do in other spaces. And I do think that's very frightening for a lot of Americans, particularly because the Americans who are most pro-Israel tend to be the ones who are most deeply invested in America's founding myths, which, as you say, are so similar to Israel's founding myths. I read recently that the closer an American town in the 19th century was to the Indian frontier, the more likely it was to have a biblical name, right? So this idea of this is very deeply in the, and I think that, I think that one of the reasons that I think, I think that you can say that Israel, one of the reasons I think it's silly to get so upset about the term settler colonialism is that many of the early Zionists were not upset about it themselves, right? They used these terms, Jabotinsky, Herzl writes to Cecil Rhodes, and says we're kind of involved in a similar project here. Colonialism was not a dirty word, right? It was a word that many early Zionists were quite happy to embrace. It meant going to a backward part of the world, bringing progress, bringing modernity, right? But it also meant bringing dispossession to the people who were there, right? And people say, well, how can it be settler colonial if Jews have this deep ancestral, religious historical tie? Well, Liberia was also a settler colonial project, right? These were people who were from West Africa, were taken to the United States, basically decided to return kind of under some degree under imperial auspices, and then basically dispossessed the people who they found, the native people in Liberia, right? They were certainly native to West Africa. It still had the features of a settler colonial project. And so it doesn't seem to me to say settler colonial is not to deny the Jewish connection to the land of Israel. It's obviously not to deny that Israel was, for many Jews coming out of displaced persons camps, experienced as a refuge, even as a liberation. I don't see why these two things have to be in conflict. But I do think it is valuable in some ways because it does turn the light on and allows us to think about our own experience, you know? And again, to go back to the point I made earlier, America doesn't have equivalent of Hamas and Gaza today, but in the 19th century, in a way, we did, right? We had herded all these Native Americans into these small enclaves. They were resisting, and America's response to this was not, you know, America's answer to this was the complete destruction of that population. And I think that it's important for us to remember that, first of all, because of our obligations here, that we barely, I mean, we don't even have kind of even Canada and Australia have land acknowledgements, like some basic recognition of the States is even far behind that, but also for us to remember that this is what we did, right? And that we often pay homage and reverence to the people who did this. So if we do that, why do we think it's impossible that something like that could happen in Israel-Palestine, right? That this project could go further and more in that direction, right? That what happened in the 19th century here could happen in the 21st century there. And so I think that's part of the value of thinking about a kind of comparative settler colonial framework. But I would just say, as Mamdani says, settler colonial colonies don't have to end the good news is they don't have to end like Algeria, and they don't have to follow the course of the United States. They can be more like South Africa, right? In which you try to actually create a system in which, regardless of where people came from and how they got there, right? That they have equality under the law, and then they move towards an even deeper form of equality over time through historical justice.
Okay, we have a lot on the table now. So let me remind you, so we're turning to the conversation now. Remember that there's these three ways of asking questions. The first two are from the mics in the room. So please, if you do want to ask a question, please find your way to one of the two mics over there. And then you can either introduce yourself or not, as you choose. Remember, the only image on the recording will be of us. And you can also send questions by email to Maggie, and that applies both to people in the room and to people who are joining us on the screen. So turning to the first question over there, where...
Thank you. My name is Randy Feldman. I'm a graduate student here. So if Israeli Jewish superiority is so unequal to be morally reprehensible to one degree or another, and you express optimism in a one-state solution, if I heard it right. The thing that we mostly hear from my grandparents would be that if everybody gets one vote, there will be no more Jewish identity in Israel. How would you deal with that critique?
Well, I mean, I don't see why Palestinians having the vote is a threat to Jewish identity. I mean, people often say to me, aren't you afraid that there'll be a Palestinian majority? To which I usually respond, there's a Palestinian majority now between the river and the sea. It's just that what you really mean is what would happen if we gave all those Palestinians the right to vote in the country in which they live, right?
In the majority.
Yes. I think that, beyond the fact that Palestinians deserve citizenship and the right to vote in the country in which they live, like all people do, I also think that Palestinians, if you're worried about Palestinian violence against Israeli Jews, I think that violence is much more likely to be a problem if you're imposing a tremendous amount of violence on Palestinians, right? And I think that even if you look at Palestinian citizens of Israel, right, who are 20% of the population, Arab Israelis, right, compared to Palestinians in Gaza, right? Palestinian citizens of Israel are very profoundly discriminated against, right? But because I think one of the reasons I think you find less violence against Israeli Jews from Palestinian citizens is that they at least have some opportunity to participate in the political system and have the government listen to them through voting, whereas Palestinians in Gaza have none, right? So no, I actually think that I don't think it's a threat to Jewish identity, and I think that if Israeli Jews are a minority of the population, first of all, I don't think politics has to be on a binary Jewish-Palestinian axis. I actually, one of the things that would be amazing about genuine legal equality, we even saw a tiny little bit of this with Mansour Abbas creating that crazy coalition with Naftali Bennett, is people have political identities that are not just Jewish Palestinian, right? I mean, I remember, it's not a very lovely example of it, but I remember when I saw this image of the chief rabbis of Israel and one of the patriarchs of the Christian group and some important imam all got together to say they denounced the gay pride march in Jerusalem, right? Now that was not a kind of transcending of your tribal ethnic divide that I was, reminded me of Woody Allen has this line where he says, I won 2 weeks in interfaith camp where I was sadistically beaten by boys of all races and creeds, so that was kind of thing. But it was just a reminder that people actually have other vectors that connect them, right? You could imagine the Hadash, the Communist Party, right, is based on the idea of a class solidarity, which brings in, that you could have business, you could have social. One of the reasons that Mansour Abbas's party broke with the other Palestinian parties was over differences over questions of gender and LGBT rights. So it seems to me one doesn't have to imagine that politics is completely binary in that sense. And if Israeli Jews are not a majority, I mean, again, I don't want to suggest the two situations are, white South Africans are 10% of the population in South Africa, right? Not only are they not being killed, they actually are maintaining a lot of their privileges, because the harsh reality is that actually long-term economic privilege endures for a long time, even under conditions of legal equality, as we can test in our own country.
Going over to that, Mike.
I'm Jack Porter, research associate at the Davis Center for Russian Studies. In the late 60s, I was the founder of the Jewish radical movement, which tried to, as you talked about, being universalist, fighting, for civil rights, the Vietnam War, but also fighting against the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, not so much from SDS and the white left, but from the Black radicals, the Black Muslims and the Black Panthers. And so all these years, and I've written a book called Jewish Radicalism, can one still be a radical Jew, not a right-wing radical, but a socialist Zionist, a labor Zionist, a progressive Zionist today?
I wish I could answer that question yes, but I would have to say, to me, if one means political Zionism, which is a state of legal supremacy of Jews over Palestinians, I find it very hard. I mean, you could want that state to be more socialist and to have, bigger, stronger labor unions or stronger welfare state or whatever, but it's still based on the idea of a kind of legalized group supremacy and hierarchy. And so what I would hope is that, is that people who have those values that they're in socialism, these values of equality, could imagine how to manifest them under conditions in which it didn't require a kind of Jewish legal privilege. One of the reasons that I worry about this, about this exception that we want to have for Israel, is what impact it has around the world. Because it seems to me we are in this kind of struggle in so many countries between a vision of equality under the law and a vision of kind of ethno-nationalism, or kind of one tribe dominating. And so a lot of American Jews want to say, we believe in equality under the law in the United States. It's what we want in Hungary. It's what we want everywhere. But we need this carve out for Israel. But then I noticed that all of a sudden you see certain groups of Hindu Americans saying, well, we would like that carve out for India. Why there's only some, if there gets to be one Jewish state that the Jews run, why can't there be one Hindu state that the Hindus run? Right? And Viktor Orban says, well, why can't we have one state for the white Christian Hungarians? Right? Seems to me. And Donald Trump says, why can't we have one state for the white Christian Americans? The white Christian American men in particular. And it seems to me Israel has become a model for a lot of people who are looking for a model of what they see as a really successful ethno-nationalist project. And I worry that you can't fight ethno-nationalism in one country while you're actually endorsing it in another.
Maggie, an email question.
Yeah, hi. We've gotten some really great emailed questions, including from one person who sent in a few questions, and I'm just going to read his first question because it's related to what you were just saying. You said that Jews enjoy supremacy over Palestinians, especially in the West Bank, but there are no laws or regulations that give Jews preference except for service in the military. There are laws and regulations that give preference to Israeli citizens, but that includes Israeli Arabs, Christians, and others. What precisely is the law or regulation that gives preference to Jews?
Okay, well, the reason that Palestinians in the West Bank can't become Israeli citizens is because they're not Jews, right? Now it's true that so the relationship between being Jewish and being an Israeli citizen in the West Bank is not incidental. It's actually fundamental. The only people in the West Bank who can be Israeli citizens basically are Jews. Now it's true that inside Israel proper, you have Palestinian citizens, Arab Israelis, right? But even inside Israel proper, the state, some of its core institutions function for the benefit of Jews, not for even all of its citizens. Again, I think I mentioned this, but I think 93% of the land in Israel proper is state land. It's parceled out by the Israel Land Authority in these long-term leases, right? The Israel Land Authority has 22 seats, 10 of which go to the Jewish National Fund, whose mission statement is the development of land for Jewish use, right? Which helps to explain, I think, why Palestinian citizens are like 20% of the population and live on 2 or 3% of the land. And according to something, right? So it's almost like you were imagining a situation in the United States where much of the land was controlled by an institution, essentially, whose mission was to develop it for the use of Christian people, right? This is why Palestinians inside Israel proper, as well as in the West Bank, can be in areas that can't actually grow and expand. I saw a statistic recently that showed that a large majority of the home demolitions inside Israel proper, not in the West Bank, Israel, are Palestinian citizens, right? Because they can't get the right to build legally, right? So this is a system of Jewish supremacy. It seems to me not just a situation of Israeliness, it's actually that the privilege that even among Israel citizens, Jewish citizens have privileges that Palestinian citizens don't have. A Palestinian citizen, for instance, can't marry a Palestinian in the West Bank and bring them and get citizenship in Israel, whereas an Israeli Jewish citizen can marry someone from anywhere and basically bring them, and then they could get citizenship immediately.
Let's take the next room question from that mic.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? My name is Konstantin Kostipsimopoulos. I'm a doctoral teaching fellow at the medical school, and I'm at the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, also the Center for Bioethics. I'm a bioethicist by training. I want to shift the conversation just slightly into health and human rights, but I keep referring to the late Paul Farmer, and many on Harvard's campus are very familiar with Dr. Paul Farmer's work and what he did for humanity in general and human rights. And this is the very department that he was chairing until recently. So we mentioned, Nazi Germany. We mentioned a little bit about, human rights. But Article 25 specifically mentions health as a human right. And we had the Nuremberg trials, and after that, the Nuremberg Code of Ethics. That was the first actual set of principles for bioethics, essentially addressing all the atrocities of the Nazi regime, et cetera, et cetera. And then we had the new DHR in 1948. So with regard to health as a human right, with what is currently the case and the status of the people who, as you said, are in an enclave, they cannot actually escape, and they're essentially being starved to death, dying. Multiple surgeries are happening without anesthetic, basic stuff, etc. So I really cannot grapple around the idea of the incapacity or inability of the world, essentially, that is observing all of this, the outside world, not to be able to at least rescue the people that would want to be rescued and escape even by sea, if not the land border. So I'm shifting the conversation a little bit to a hypothetical, but really, why is it that we cannot do anything as humanity, essentially, for the people who desperately want to escape all of this? And I'm not talking about where to go or whatnot. I haven't thought this through. But I know that this happened in a similar situation where we had the destruction of Smyrna in Asia Minor in 1922 during the Ottoman collapse. My grandmother actually escaped as a refugee in 1922, an 11-year-old girl. And they escaped by sea. That was the only escape. So I keep drawing this parallel. And I'm thinking, why is it that why on earth couldn't we do something in the name of human rights to rescue some people, at least some? So I know I'm shifting the conversation, but health as a human right, I think, is important. Thank you.
I mean, I think that I think Palestinians' first choice would be just for the bombs to stop and for people, you know, and for food to be allowed in, because I think that some Palestinians might take that option, but I think other Palestinians are very afraid, with good reason, that they would never be allowed back, right? And so this is an ancestral trauma of being expelled. Most of those people are from the families of people who are expelled, and they don't want to be expelled again, which is understandable. So it seems to me that, you know, I thought that, you know, the simplest answer would be to say, stop doing the things that are killing so many Palestinians, and then move towards us, and then think about what kind of political environment you need in which people in Gaza can live and flourish, and that if people in Gaza don't want to live in Gaza because they're mostly not from Gaza and they want to be able to return to the places they're from, create a political environment in which that's possible, right? I think that would be, for me, a better outcome than you know, putting them in a ship and taking them goodness knows where.
Going back to that, Mike.
Professor, I've seen some Israeli commentators, for example, the Refusnik Talmidnik, talk about how the newer generations in Israel are becoming more right-wing, and how this is like very unique in a global sense. Do you think this is driven by, like, is this just like the logical conclusion of an ethno-state project, or is it maybe like the only way to mentally cope with like living in an apartheid system, or is there something more specific or concrete than that you think is at play here?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure that I am the best equipped to answer it. I do think that partly there's a demographic shift in Israel. So people who are Dati or Haredi, what we would call kind of like modern Orthodox or ultra Orthodox, tend to be more further to the right, and they are more represented in the younger populations in Israel. I also think that there's perhaps less interaction between Israeli Jews and Palestinians than there might have been in previous generation eras, where Palestinians were more able from the West Bank and Gaza to come into work and interact with Israeli Jews. But you may also may be true that my fear is that we may be going down this spiral, this downward spiral, in which you know, as people have grown up in this idea where they've been told that that Palestinians can't be given their own country, that they won't, that's not a safe option, it's not a possible option, that they have to you have to have a way of justifying this situation. And I think all around the world, you know, you can't really justify denying people equality and human rights unless you find ways of dehumanizing them. That's not just true for Israeli Jews, that's true for people around the world. And so it seems to me that's something that is progressed even in Israel Palestine among younger people. It makes it all the more admirable that they're and really impressive and inspiring when there are young Israeli Jews who actually say no.
Maggie, you want to give us 2 questions from there?
Oh, sure. The first question is from a current student who asks, or who says, I'll read her words directly. You mentioned the importance of Jews and Palestinians having uncomfortable conversations and learning from each other. As a Palestinian student, I've had many such conversations in the past. However, in this particular moment, it seems impossible to share my experiences and opinions with my fellow students. First, there's significant fear of doxing, which has impacted many of my fellow classmates. Second, there is a great deal of grief and resentment over what is happening in Gaza that makes it difficult for me to have a level-headed conversation with anyone who supports the war. What advice do you have to Palestinian students on how to navigate this moment?
Wow, I don't know that I'm really in a position to answer that question, given that I haven't had that experience myself, and I can imagine how profoundly difficult it is. I guess all I would say is that I have seen again and again and again how experiences with Palestinians that are in conditions of relative equality and conditions that are conducive to learning, that are not conditions that are structured by violence and by hierarchy, that how profoundly they can change people. And so I understand it's a tremendous burden to put on Palestinians at a moment like this to have to kind of play that role. But I also think that if there's going to be change, that change that a lot of people have to rethink things that they thought before. And Palestinians have so often been silenced in the conversation that I think that Palestinian voices are really, really crucial. I also think that it's important for Palestinians and other people to listen to Jews as well. I mean, I don't want to suggest that I think this is only a one-way conversation. There are experiences of Jewish trauma and anxiety that may be hard for people from the outside to understand, because they might just see Israel as this very powerful country, and they may see Jews as a pretty successful group in the United States. And it's important to actually, I think, listen to people the narrative they have grown up with about what it means to be Jewish, as opposed to the outside narrative you might have of, well, they look like these white people who look like they're doing fine and everybody caters to them, or whatever you might think, right? And I think that's especially true when one talks about when one is encountering Jews who haven't been in the United States as long, Jews who might have more closer family experience in Jewish communities that are more fragile, and to understand what Israel means to them. You don't have to agree with their point of view, but to understand it, I think, is something that's really, really important. I often find that when I look at younger American Jews who tend to be more pro-Israel and more firmly rooted in their Zionism, if they're not, obviously, Orthodox kids are more likely, but oftentimes I find it is the children of immigrants, whether their parents are from Russia, or their parents are from Iran, or their parents are from Argentina. Those often tend to be more invested in Israel, and I do think it's because of a greater closeness to this experience of fragility and insecurity. And I think it's important to listen to that and to understand it and to learn from it, even if one doesn't come out of the same place politically.
Another question from online is, given the fact that Netanyahu has proven himself to be ultimately self-interested while leveraging the remaining hostages as political shield, especially after his leaked comment about Qatar, do you think there's enough of an opposition movement within Israel to dethrone him from power? And who do you think would fill the vacuum in his absence?
I mean, the polls suggest that Benny Gantz would be the most popular politician now, kind of centrist, kind of military guy. It's hard for me to understand like what the mechanism is that gets Israel to an election, because it would have to be people from Netanyahu's own coalition that were willing to leave the coalition, bring down the government, has 64 seats in the Knesset out of 120, and go to elections. But it seems to me there's this weird, I heard someone say that this is actually true in general in parliamentary systems. I don't know if this is true, but basically the more popular governments become, the more they hold together, right? Because they don't want to go to elections because they know they would lose, right? So it seems to me there's a way in which these members of this coalition have a even though the Israeli public in general wants to go to elections and they want to vote Likud out, that the people in the party might have in the government might have a self-interest in keeping this going. And it's also hard to exactly imagine how an election works in the middle of a war. But it's hard to see, since Netanyahu has a self-interest in not going to an election, and it's not clear to me how this war ever exactly ends. It's not clear to me what that mechanism is. So I don't know, but there are probably people who are better versed in Israeli politics who might have scenarios that I can't see. But the sooner it happens, the better, certainly.
Going back to that, Mike.
Yeah. Hi, Ahmed, sophomore at the college. So just quick anecdote. 2 floors down in October 1995, Yasser Arafat gave a speech, and it was the first time and last time a Palestinian leader was invited to a college campus in the US. And 2 weeks after was supposed to be Rabin's turn, but he was killed. And I say this not to say that I expect Abbas and Netanyahu to come to Harvard, but it's just to show that Harvard took a proactive stance during the Oslo Accords, and they actually played a part in the Oslo Accords. And to build on the first question about students, My question is, what should Harvard, being the leading academic institution in the world, do during this conflict? And how should they not only promote discourse, but promote maybe a solution even?
I don't know if it's, I mean, there are a lot of smart people at Harvard, so I'm sure there are lots of people at Harvard who have ideas about a solution. But I guess it just seems to me that the most important fundamental to do at this point is to stand up for academic freedom and the rights of students and faculty to take positions on this issue and to be willing to stand up to their own donors who want to use this as an opportunity to suppress speech that they don't like. Now, again, if there are students or organizations that are harassing and intimidating individual students or committing violence, of course, there should be disciplinary procedures. But the thing that drove me insane about watching your former president going in front of this committee of members of Congress is that I felt like, at least Stefanik stipulates that the term intifada means genocide of Jews, right? That's her premise, right? Which is a really stupid premise, right? Because in Tunisia, when they had a rebellion, the Arab Spring, they called it an intifada, right? And the intifada means uprising, right? So you could disagree with things that are done in intifada. I certainly profoundly disagree with attacks on civilians that happened, especially in the second intifada. But it's a kind of uprising in the context of oppression. It's not a direct. It's not a call for Jewish genocide. But Claudine Gay somehow felt like she was in a position where she couldn't contest that premise. She couldn't engage on the substance at all. And because she couldn't contest the premise, she got herself in this ridiculous position of essentially accepting the premise and then making it sound like, accepting the idea that there are these mass calls for Jewish genocide all over Harvard Yard, and then saying that she's kind of okay with them, right? And that seemed to be to represent a kind of like defensiveness or a kind of unwillingness to like call out, frankly, the bullshit that we hear so often from these politicians and some of these donors. And I would like these presidents to be a little bit more feisty. Now I understand they probably have their reasons. Maybe you don't get to be president of Harvard if that's your personality type. But I really worry that as being pro-Palestinian, supporting Palestinian liberation becomes a stronger and stronger force among young people in progressive environments, that the push to silence and ban these movements will grow stronger because they will become more formidable. And I think it's not a coincidence that the champion of this was Elise Stefanik, or that the champion in Florida is now Ron DeSantis, right? Who banned the Students for Justice in Palestine chapters on the University of Florida. It's not a coincidence that he's the guy who the day before was basically banning the teaching of white supremacy, right? Like, you're putting yourself in league with a group of people whose basic solution to a more diverse and more progressive younger generation on the issue of Palestinians and on a whole range of issues is basically to try to shut down conversations that are threatening and difficult for a kind of particular vision of a kind of mythic America. And that's something that I think universities really, really need to fight hard against. And I just don't, it seems to me like, I don't know, I mean, again, I'm not a university administrator, but like, what's the point of having an endowment of like $1 billion if you can't tell some donors to fuck off? I mean, like, I just don't know, like, why have that endowment, right? Anyway, that's what my advice.
Okay, so let's take like the last round of questions together. So that means one question from the room from the mic, then one from Maggie, and then both of you over there, since you're both there. So let's take these 4 questions together. And then Peter will have the opportunity to wrap up in response to these things. Please. Yeah, by all means, yeah.
I'll try to be quick. I'm just curious to hear more about the role of America in this. It seems to me that Israeli history has always been shaped by the great power of the time, whether that was the British and now the Americans. And yeah, just curious to hear more of your analysis, what America has meant for the situation recently and where that's going.
Perfectly timed question, because this one is about what's your sense of how Biden's handling of the situation in Gaza will affect his re-election chances as we head into this election year?
Okay, so about the last question around settler colonialism. So I'm an academic, so academically, this is the framework I work with, but I'm thinking politically or strategically. I mean, some crimes are too big to quantify, and some crimes are too big to even kind of like deal with. I feel like even in terms of reparation. We're like bringing in settler colonialism would mean that we're bringing in a 500-year history or more. And it's kind of like, it's overwhelming the situation that we're dealing with right now by opening up all those kind of Pandora box, like so many ghosts are coming back to hunt us now. So don't you think that there might be another way of posing the question of justice that does not lead to that? Like, it feels like we're dealing with something that is too big, that is too overwhelming, that is too long, that is even bigger than Palestine or Zionism.
And the last question also from that mic.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for this. My name is Elom, and more of a half question, half reflection, but we're in the leading academic institution in the world with scholars of decolonial history and violence and peace and all these really fancy names and institutes. But it's not lost on me. I'm from Ghana, and I heard stories about the colonial empire, the British Empire in Ghana, and I have friends across the region. It's not lost on me that almost 30,000 people dead. As an institution, we've not been able to speak to the let's go beyond political situation, the humanitarian issue. It's almost as if we're all holding our breath to speak to it after things have happened. And I think for me, there's a disillusionment that has come with academia, because everyone has put their tails between their legs for fear of donors, for fear of repercussions, whatever it might be. And I wonder, in your opinion, what this is doing to the character of the American intellectual institution. Because if we can say it now, when else can we say it?
That's a very powerful question. I guess on America's role, I would just say I think America's role, recent decades has been to basically ensure that Israel can act with impunity. That it has the military support and the diplomatic support to do that. And I think that's been disastrous. It's among other things, I think it's part of the reason that Netanyahu has been so politically successful. Because if you look at Netanyahu's kind of centrist opponents, I don't want to idealize them, but Tzipi Livni and Ehud Barak, one of the things they were saying, more than a decade ago was, if we go down this path that Netanyahu takes us of destroying a possibility of a Palestinian state, we'll become a pariah in the world. And Netanyahu said, no, we won't. Basically, he said, America will be fine, right? And in fact, he was proven correct. And I think that's part of the reason for the ascendance of the Israeli right, that there hasn't been a cost in terms of America's relationship with Israel, with the United States and Europe. In terms of Biden's, I worry a tremendous amount. I mean, obviously, I think the policy is horrible, and I also worry about how it'll really hurt his re-election chances. Because there are many people that I would rather have be president than Joe Biden, but I would prefer Joe Biden to Donald Trump, right? And if you can't go to speak to your own base, right, in a Black church or in a union hall without being disrupted by people who are protesting you, it seems to me that's a bad sign, right? Because election campaigns rely on enthusiasm, on passion, on not just people voting, but people going out and knocking on doors. Like, you need passion behind you. You need people who believe in you. And so I think it's very, very, very disturbing to me. I don't understand, even from a political perspective. I mean, maybe if they took a position in which they were calling for a ceasefire and they were going to stop certain weapons shipments. I mean, I'm sure there would be some Democrats in Congress who are upset at them, and maybe there'll be, but I actually think at this point, it's hard for me to see how politically that would be worse than the path they're going down now. Especially like they think Netanyahu has a self-interest in ending the war to get Joe Biden off the hook. First of all, having the war going on keeps him in power. Secondly, he would rather have Donald Trump in power, right? So you're going to bet that this guy's going to fish your bacon out of the fire, whatever the number. It doesn't seem to me to make sense politically at all. On the question of settler colonialism, I mean, I take your point, but I guess I also just feel like the dangers to me are greater in not grappling with these histories than in grappling with them. Because I think that one of the points that many people have made, from Ta-Nehisi Coates to Desmond Tutu to many others, is that if you don't try to face the histories to some degree, that it is more likely to repeat them, and that is what I worry about Israel-Palestine. It's also I worry about the United States. And on the question of intellectual responsibility, it's a great question. I should go back, actually. Your question made me realize that I really should go back and read. Noam Chomsky wrote this famous essay, I think it was in 1967. I think it was actually first given as a talk at Harvard Hill, if I'm not mistaken, called On the Responsibility of Intellectuals, which was really an attack on the kind of the best and the brightest coming out of places like Harvard and MIT, George Bundy, Walt Rostow, basically guiding the war in Vietnam. And he was, I think, trying to make a distinction, which he ended up kind of embodying in his own life, about different kinds of intellectuals, right? Intellectuals who basically advise power, right? And they can be, Henry Kissinger, you can be a very smart person, right? But you kind of circumscribe yourself intellectually and morally in order to fit within the frameworks that are hospitable within in circles of power, or intellectuals who kind of are opposed and are willing to be kind of outcasts, because they're not willing to. And one of the things, I used to live in Washington, one of the things that always struck me about foreign policy conversations in Washington was they were bounded by the sense of what was politically acceptable in Washington politics. And it was, people didn't even allow themselves, I found, to think outside those terms. And it seems to me the point of a university should be precisely, that's what should make Harvard different than, the Brookings Institution or something like that, right? Is that you should delight and you should encourage people to think outside of those boundaries, right? And if those boundaries put you in very deep opposition to the behavior of the state in which you live, then you should let yourself intellectually and morally go in that place. And that's what I think, those are the intellectuals that really inspire me. One of the people who's actually been asking this question a lot, I don't see the questioner, is Osama Makdisi at Berkeley. I've just been noticing him asking this question. I don't know if he's planning on writing something about it, but I do think it's a really, really important question. And I do think that's part of the struggle that's taking place over universities, about universities today, is, are universities going to be able to do those things that make them challenging? Or is there going to be some kind of closing down as people try to rein universities in and stop them from actually being the kind of institutions that can think really subversive thoughts?
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions to this. As I said at the beginning, this is a historical turning point, what's happening in the world right now. And it is overwhelming for any of us really to see what is going to come in the future. But the one thing, among the things at least, that a university can do is to have conversations, to exchange views, to talk about positions, to talk about the relevant concepts here, to exchange ideas about these things. To do that in a brave, courageous way for all of us to find a way of doing that kind of thing. And Peter, your voice is very important in this discussion, and we all need to make our contribution here, and also to make universities a useful contribution to what will happen in the world around these things. So thank you all for this conversation, especially Peter Beinart. Thank you to you for joining us.